and everything. And each time the discussion went in a wrong way, the SACP comrades and some of the consulting comrades jumped in to defend me without me having to defend myself. I think some of them had heard me in the other ones. So I've had quite a few engagements with SACP. I spoke to the leadership in the what you call it, in the Northern Cape, and the comrades of the young communists in KZN as well. And so I had no option but to, because I think that the Communist Party, I was telling comrades Tembiso and Alex that I think you have a lot more power than you think you have, to influence these debates. Because at the end of the lecture to the PEC, everybody was in agreement that we can't have austerity. Austerity is the wrong way to go. And if we can replicate it perhaps with other PECs, I'm sure there could be a groundswell of movement in the ANC and also maybe in civil society. But I strongly believe that you can't just focus on winning the debates within the movement. You must also focus on winning debates in civil society, because the ANC decision makers also operate in civil society. And if they're getting pressure from their families and everybody around them, they have to change their views eventually. So I do think that I think there's a critical mass of people seeking alternative views, and I think we should capitalize on it, and we should bring a broad range of people to support this movement. Try and share the screen now, Jenny. Oh, you've still disabled the screen, yeah. I can't share the screen, Jenny. Jenny? Jenny's on mute.
You have the right to share.
Okay, thank you. You are on mute just now. Where is this thing? Sorry to show you my disastrous. I found it, yes. Thank you. Can you see the screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much, comrades, again. So I'll start by...
Comrade Zuma?
Yeah.
We can see your screen, but we can see the entire thing. You may want to open the presentation in presentation format, because it's showing us all of your documents as well.
Oh, sorry. Let me just stop the share and start again. Yeah. Sorry, comrades. Yeah.
No problem. No problem.
It's usually not difficult. I'll just do this quickly. Okay, now I'll just share now. Okay. There it is. There we are. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry for that late start, but we'll make up ground. But what I thought I should do is just to give a little bit of background as to how we got into this crisis, and just a little bit of background just to understand. And it's not like an intensive understanding of how we got into the crisis, but I've been involved in these debates for a long time. Many times I've not been in the public domain, but I remember, like, when I came out of university, when I returned to South Africa during the later apartheid years, one of the early influences was I went and interviewed, was it Ben Turok and Vela Pillay at the Macroeconomic Research Group. I started working in the media, and I didn't really have any political views. And some of the most, influential interviews I had with Vela Pillay, one of the greatest economics in the movement history. I was really inspired as a young person, but I obviously over the years forgot many of Vela's lessons, but now I've been returning to them recently in terms of the work I'm doing. And what you'll see, comrades, is that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said in a different context that she talked about the Nigerian author about the danger of a single narrative. Now in South Africa, there's one view that totally dominates all debates in the economy. You would have heard it from the finance minister, fine fellow, and the central bank governor. And by the way, I met the finance minister in Scotland while I was for the first time, and we had a very long, heated debate around the economy. I was still young, you know, and he was talking about some housing model, and I thought he was a crazy communist or a lefty, and I didn't see myself as a lefty in those days. Well, I just thought he's to the left of me, and we parted. But anyway, many of you will have heard what the mainstream view on Keynesian economic policy. It's about the use of counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policies to stimulate aggregate demand. Heterodox economists bring attention to a wider range of microeconomic policy tools, which I'll talk about a little, that can be used to achieve macroeconomic policy objectives. And lately, there's this new school of thought called modern monetary theory, where they break down the artificial separation between monetary and fiscal policy. They say that a central bank can finance government spending. So I just have to mention, about 5 years ago, my two sons were away with their mothers in Tanzania and Ethiopia. And I decided I'm going to spend the Christmas holidays reading about MMT, because I had no clue what it was about, but it was coming up a lot in a lot of debates. I wasn't any wiser after spending 3 weeks reading about it, but over the years, I have become influenced by some of the ideas from modern monetary theory. At a popular level, I think what resonates with what we can put forward, it's a very dense thing, but I would recommend a book by Stephanie Kelton, The Deficit Myth. It's a popular version of modern monetary theory. And I have to mention that a lot of the white male people who are the proponents of modern monetary theory, they're a bit dense and difficult to follow, but Stephanie Kelton is very easy to follow. And what people can also learn at a popular level is that the difference between a national economy and a household or a company. So what they say is, there's two things, is that a household or a company is not the issuer of the currency. So the government has got the power to issue the currency. And then the second issue is that, you know, this is also from Keynes, like when the government spends money into the economy, it gets some of the money back. And I was reading in the latest IMF fiscal monitor, they said that the multipliers for infrastructure spending are 2.7. So if you spend a rand of infrastructure, it gets 2.7 back. And then a lot of the debate around consumption spending, basic income grants suggests that the money that you get back from consumption spending is maybe 0.5. So if you blend a recovery program to include both of those measures, you could get a lot of the money back. And that's some of the things I want to talk about later. There was about 15 years ago, this discussion around the developmental state, and I became obsessed with it. I bought many books and wara. But I tried to summarize it into one slide. And most of these countries had a mobilizing vision and plan. China, Malaysia, Japan, South Korea. I became obsessed with Ethiopia, following their things. And what I found very amazing, it was that the president, the previous one, what was his called? I forget his long name, but anyway, he used to say, we are following the South Korean model with Ethiopian characteristics. And all the leaders of Ethiopia at the time, that's what they said they're following. You need, obviously, the state capacity to initiate growth and development. And this is a very important issue in South Africa, where we've had the decimation of state capacity in the last decade and before. Let's not forget, before the last decade, there was also the decimation of state capacity. And I remember reading about health sector in the Eastern Cape. The former MEC, Trudy Thomas, she was talking about how gear had decimated the health capacity in the Eastern Cape. You also need high rates of investment, capital formation. And in recent years, after the fiscal stimulus in China, it was about 50%. Yeah. We also had high levels of human development, and this was very important in terms of education and health. I was looking recently at South Korea, the most educated country in the world. 70% of South Koreans between the ages of 25 and 35 have got a tertiary qualification. And the tertiary enrollment rate in South Korea is 94%. This is 20 to 24-year-olds in tertiary education. In South Africa, it's 22%, and for Black Africans, it's much less than that. So they've got a similar population as us, but they've got a much higher tertiary enrollment rate. And we used to talk back in the day about massification of education. And I think this is perhaps what we need in South Africa as well. And then the second thing I found is that these countries as well, when we're talking about the COVID response, they've got, they didn't develop the national health insurance immediately. But you'll remember that maybe in the mid-90s, there was a lot of unrest in South Korea, you know, and it was like people in their suits, middle-class people were complaining about, you know, but anyway, they set up a welfare system, not a national health system. So now what you have in Japan and South Korea, you have national health insurance system. And in terms of the COVID response, these countries were well prepared for the COVID response. They had free testing, free healthcare, and so forth. But I must mention quickly the South Korean model as we debate our model. There's a national health insurance fund, but there's private provision of health services. So that's as opposed to the British model where there's a fund and there's mostly public provision. They also they taught the world about industrial upgrading. So this explains how you move from agriculture to industry and then to services. And then within industry, you start off with light manufacturing and areas that can create job. And then as you upgrade the education of your people, you move up the value chain. And recently, when I went on a study tour to China, they're talking about green development, lush green development. And they're also talking about high technology and artificial intelligence and all of those things. And as I said, they didn't start off with social security system, but I thought that in terms of locating this developmental stage within South Africa, we have to talk about social security. Globally, the debate is around the job guarantee, which has been favored by the modern monetary theorists and basic income, and people like Professor Guy Standing and so on. But now the key learning I had from this is, compared to what I learned at university in Scotland, is that these countries use a wider range of policy tools than Keynes. You'll see maybe they've got, I don't know, they use exchange rates to support their export strategy, state control over finance. If you look at the fiscal stimulus in China since 2008, most of what you see in China, well, a lot, was built in the last 12 years. And the state banks financed most of the fiscal stimulus. And the action wasn't so much in the budget, the national treasury. The central bank, if you just allow me, comrades, the central bank has been pivotal in financing this thing. So the total debt in China now is about 300% of GDP. And people come from the West to study the system and they write books about it and they just don't understand it. But just quickly, so the state-owned banks have financed this. They separate they've got the state-owned banks, which have got like some kind of commercial mandates, the 4 banks, and then they've got the 3 policy banks, what we call developmental finance institutions. So these, the commercial banks went bust at the beginning of the century, and the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank, People's Bank of China, put in place a $500 billion package to rescue these banks. And then they bought majority shares in the banks and listed them on the stock exchange. And the same with the policy banks. Now you see China Development Bank financing the Africa strategy, financing the Belt and Road Initiative. So they've got multiple targets and objects. So they've also got, capital controls to prevent the capital from going in and out. As you know, the Chinese capital account was closed until recently, and it's still very stringent. Prescribed asset, that's a debate in the movement, and credit quotas, differential interest rates, one for consumption, one for production. They've also got multiple targets and multiple objectives. And I believe that our inflation targeting system with one target and one tool is primitive. So we need close coordination of monetary, fiscal, industrial policies. And this has implications for the mandate and independence of central banks. Just the last 26 years, what you see now is that GDP per capita, which takes into account the growth of the population, it is 28% higher than it was in 2019. Because in per capita terms, we've grown by about 1% a year. So we had the gear period quickly between 1996 and 2003, but the bottom line, there was slash and burn fiscal policies, cuts in capital spending, sky high interest rates, but the unemployment, the broad definition, doubles to 8 million people, 40.6% in March 2003, from 4 million people in 1995. I actually asked Stats SA to develop this time series for me, because the time series gets broken and you don't really understand what's going on. 2004 to 2008, we had the world equities and commodity boom. We had expansionary monetary and fiscal policies. Interest rates dropped to 600 basis points, by 600 basis points to 7%. Government spending increased. Now, many people say this was driven by the world equities and commodity boom, but I don't think that's true, because all sectors of the economy created jobs. And during this period, we created 3.1 million jobs. The unemployment rate fell to 28.7% from 40.6%. The only sectors not to create jobs were mining and I think agriculture during that period. And mining GDP, all the presentations from the Chamber of Mines, the Minerals Council nowadays, they were lamenting the fact that we didn't benefit from this commodity boom. And they produced lots of statistics to prove this thing, which I use in my thing. And then we had the last decade of economic development. We failed to recover from the global financial crisis. So just quickly, people say it was because of the global situation, but what you see on the slide is that most countries recovered from the global financial crisis through expansionary monetary and fiscal policies, although Europe withdrew the monetary and fiscal stimulus, but many of the emerging markets, they grew by 5% a year and 7% in emerging and developing Asia. So in South Africa, the bottom row, there has been zero growth in GDP per capita. And now there's a bit of confusion. I've been doing a lot of work doing a paper for someone about what happened over the past decade, and I haven't yet finished it. I'll share it with you at a later stage. But basically, we must look at two periods. So what happened in 2009, 2010, there was a counter-cyclical fiscal response. In real terms, after taking into account inflation, there was double-digit increases in non-interest expenditure in 2009 and 2010. So what you had in 2009 is that because of the recession, there was a 3% drop in tax revenue, 16% increase in nominal terms before inflation in government spending. So that resulted in a small surplus turning around to a deficit of about 6 or 7%. So there was a quick response, because as economists say, government spending is sticky. You can't just stop it immediately because there's a global financial crisis. So now I'm talking about the next period between 2010 and 2013. So there was a sort of, what also happened during this period, comrades, is that Jill Marcus reversed the mistakes of Tito Mboweni, who had increased interest rates after the start of the global financial crisis by 250 basis points. After June, the starting point, everybody agrees, of this crisis was in June 2007, and he increased interest rates by 250 basis points after the start of the crisis. So Jill Marcus, when she came in, she reversed that, and the most aggressive monetary easing that we've ever seen in the post-apartheid period, 700 basis points. And then there was a recovery in the economy. What you'll see here at the bottom is that GDP increased by almost 3% a year, and public investment increased. It was a slow recovery. It was 12.7%, 1.4% on average, and government consumption spending grew by 3.1% on average. But it wasn't a very big spending by the government, but the point is we were not yet in what I would call austerity mode. And what you had here, according to Treasury, you had tax surplus of 29 billion rand. It's a very small surplus, but we had a surplus during those periods. So what happened is that austerity took over, I'm not sure exactly when it was, around 2014, and the expenditure ceiling. So what you see is that this is investment spending on the first row. It has increased declined by 17.6% from 2015. Public corporations declined by 27% since 2015. So public investment in total general government and public corporations has declined by 22%. Government consumption spending, remember it was 3% in the last period, went down to 1.1%. So what you've seen since then is a collapse of what we call the trend rate of growth from 3% to 1%. And what does that cause? The government keeps under hitting its revenue targets. So in that period, we've had tax shortfalls of 250 billion rands. And more importantly, GDP per capita declined for 5 consecutive years between 2015 and 2019. So we have now what the party refers to, I never stop saying this, the crisis before the crisis. We've had unemployment increased by, these figures are a bit dated, but I'll give you the latest ones. Oh yeah, these are correct, yeah. So we had unemployment increased by 4.4 million since December 2008. You must remember that these statistics, as the president said, we had about a few million people who just went off the statistical radar. So these figures are not a true reflection of actually the real unemployment rate, but the real unemployment rate, there's 13 million unemployed people in South Africa. But anyway, there's 46.3% unemployment for Black Africans, 50.2% for Black African females, 52.8% in the Eastern Cape. We have had, you remember, 64% poverty rate amongst Black Africans, the most unequal country in the world, with a Gini of 63 for income and 95 for wealth. As I said, 5 years of declining GDP per capita, 2 recessions in 2 years, in 2018 and 2019, 3 consecutive quarters of declining GDP by March 2020, and we were heading for our 3rd recession in 3 years in 2020. And we've had 7 out of 10 quarters before COVID of declining GDP, 8 out of 10 quarters of declining investment, despite 3 investment summits where pledges of actually more than R1 trillion, it's actually about R1 trillion of, pledges of 660 billion were made in the 2 investment summits. And in the summit that was held by the Infrastructure Agency, they also talked about 340 billion rand. So that is about R1 trillion of investments that have been announced. But investment is declining, and I'll try and explain that's why it's happening. So I believe that since the lockdown, we've entered a 4th phase of the post-apartheid economy. We're witnessing the shocks of a crisis that could eviscerate the dreams of our liberation. At the end of 2020, right at the beginning, I said, my first things that I wrote, I did a few calculations. I said, we're going to be 10% down. Because, so I think it's going to be true. So after this 10% drop in GDP at the end of this year, we'll be only 15% higher than we were in 1994. Then we've had this crony corona capitalism, where the corruption in terms of the PPE contracts, the emergency procurement, we should have known what would happen when we said emergency procurement. And there's this vulgar neoliberalism, this obsession with inflation targeting. And there is no inflationary threat in the economy by definition, because we're in a depression, irrelevant structural reforms, and unprecedented austerity. I believe this will deepen the depression and result in 3 years of declining GDP. And you might be aware, comrades, there's this debate between the Presidential Economic Advisory Council, which has condemned hard austerity. And then the Advisory Council advocates soft austerity. So what the council, they used a paper by economists called Berger, where Berger showed that for you to deliver this austerity that the Treasury is talking about, you'll have to increase what is called the primary surplus, which is the deficit without interest spending. So to about 7% of GDP from minus 1.6% where it was just before COVID. And he said that is unprecedented, even for IMF structural reform programs. And IMF structural reforms call for a 4% primary surplus. So he says the soft austerity, which the Advisory Council believes in, is 4%. So this is extreme and unprecedented level of austerity that Treasury is. And the fact that it's worse than what the IMF recommends for countries. Yeah, so after this period of 3 years of declining GDP, I believe that we will be barely richer than we were in 1994. Unemployment is heading towards 50%, at which point the whole society will become unviable. The social fabric of our society will be irreversibly scarred. The UNDP says it could take 5 years to go back to 2019 levels of GDP. The collateral damage, as the NIDS crime survey said, could be with us for the next decade. So after a lost decade, depending on the decisions that we make, we could be ending into a second lost decade in terms of economic development. I just want to talk a little bit about the COVID response. I just compared a few countries. South Africa, 59.6 million people, 700,000 infections, 18,000 deaths, and daily infections, 1,928. South Korea, which I've been following throughout this crisis, it's an incredible case study. It's better than all the other ones that I'm going to talk about. 51.6 million. Let me just say, I've left China out of it. I came back from China with Comrades Tembi, so very sick in November. I might have had COVID and immunity. But because of the extreme nature of the lockdown we had in Wuhan, I think most people feel that you can't replicate that, although they did implement the public health measures that these other countries have also implemented. Yeah, so I tend to leave China out of this. The daily, now remember, South Korea was the second epicenter after China. There was a cluster that emerged around a church, and the Western media referred to as a religious cult. The religious cult was uncooperative with the government of South Korea, and they just refused point blank to provide the context of the people who were at this church convention, because contact tracing is very important for them. But eventually they brought that cluster under control, and the daily deaths came down. The deaths have been 444, and the daily infections currently are 91. But let me just mention, on the 1st of March, daily infections in South Korea peaked at 1,062. 2 weeks later, they were at 74 when they got that cluster of the church out. They launched that cluster out of the church. In Japan, they've a very different model, 126 million people, 84,000 infections, 1,670 deaths, and daily infections, when I looked, it's about 1,346. Now, the Japan, remember there was the Diamond Princess, the ship that was there around Japan, and they developed a unique model of, while South Korea is extensive testing, China was extensive testing. They tested every person in Wuhan, 11 million people in Wuhan, by the way, recently when there's a flare-up. So they just put on the testing at the stroke of a pen. So in Japan, they have this system called prospective testing. Let me explain it. So there is, if I get sick, and then what happens normally, you go and test all the people that I've met and through contact tracing, but they look at where was I when I got tested. It's called backward testing. If I was at the church, they'll test the people who were at the church. So they would do both the testing of the people who were where I got infected and whatever. So just quickly, I just want to mention about this testing, the both ways of testing. There's been a flare-up in South Korea. There was in May. People were going to nightclubs, and people got sick from going to these nightclubs. But the testing regime was so efficient that they rounded up 46,000 people who had been in close contact with those people who went to the nightclub. And then they brought down that cluster. Vietnam, people are confused about this one. 95.5 million people, daily infections, 1,100, sorry, infections, total infections, 1,126. But the government took control over the production of masks, and they banned the exports of masks, and they just, it was state-heavy intervention that took control of the situation, and 35 deaths. And the daily infections are, sorry, man, I'm talking about the wrong one, sorry. I was talking about Taiwan. So in Vietnam, it's the one that people didn't understand. It's 1,126 infections, 35 deaths, and two daily infections. People are still trying to understand what is the situation in Vietnam. Ethiopia, 109 million people, 88,000 infections, and 1,346 deaths. So that is another example. They used community health workers to do the contact tracing. They've built isolation centers and quarantine centers as well. So basically what I want to say about the Asian responses is that they have had, what we can't replicate is that they've had knowledge of previous pandemics, SARS and MERS. Now, during 2015, during MERS, South Korean government botched according to the people, they botched the response. They were not transparent. They didn't tell people what was going on, and people got really angry. So this one went to an extreme where they have a software system that monitors people. It's even gone to the extreme sense that it infringes on personal liberties, because when the guy was going to the nightclub, the people could monitor on their cell phones what was going on, but although they don't tell the names, but people feel that it's gone a bit too far in terms of personal liberties. So I want to say, comrades, there's no correlation between severity of lockdowns and success in bringing the virus under control. Because if you look at the countries with the heaviest lockdowns, South Africa, Peru, Argentina, and some of the Argentina and Colombia, they've had severe lockdowns. There's an index that measures these lockdowns at Oxford University, and they've had the worst outcomes in terms of deaths and so forth. But in Japan, for example, their lockdown is less stringent than Sweden. Their constitution doesn't allow them to have a lockdown, so they had to appeal to the people. And the people obviously did comply, although there wasn't a legal. So they had light lockdowns in South Korea, but they were successful in bringing the virus under controls. Lockdowns delay the spread, in my personal view. They don't break this transmission chain. And I don't think it's about culture. You know, the culture explanation was used by many people in the West to explain the so-called East Asian miracle. And they discovered that, no, it wasn't about the culture. But these are some of them, Japan, South Korea, vibrant democracies. And as I said, they had uncooperative churches. There was another cluster in August where this church had anti-government marches and they defied social distancing. So it's not like it's a messy democracy like we are. But what I want to say is that hand washing is important, masks are important, social distancing is important, and the banning of super spreader events to prevent infections, that is very important. But the decisive actions in these countries are the public health measures implemented after a person gets tested. Number one is rapid testing. There's new technologies now that allow, it's a paper strip test that you can test, you can get your results in 15 minutes. So people are, the hope is that rapid testing could be the solution, whereby you isolate the people who test. So we would go and test weekly, whatever, the whole population. And then people who get sick, they would be isolated. You take them out of the pool, and then contact tracing, isolation of infected people, and quarantines of close contacts who may not be affected. Just two quotes from Tedros. Tedros says, Rwanda's progress is due to a combination of strong leadership, universal health coverage, well-supported health workers, and clear public communication. All testing and treatment of COVID-19 is free in Rwanda, so there are no financial barriers to getting people tested. And when people test positive, they're isolated, and health workers then visit every potential contact and test them for the virus. Now, the other thing is that there's been second waves in Europe, but I believe that a second wave is when it's a number of clusters that get out of control when you don't get your clusters under control. So clusters, you have them everywhere, but you don't have second waves in South Korea, but you have you have sort of like flare-ups, which they quickly extinguish. The trick, as Tedros says, is for them now, some countries in Western Europe, to focus on identifying those clusters of the disease, identifying new community transmission, and putting in place the kind of localized measures that can contain the virus, suppress the virus, and reduce exposure, and try to avoid, if possible, having the countrywide lockdowns that have done so much damage before. That requires a very sophisticated approach. It requires localized data, rapid turnaround of testing, that is very important, fast investigation of clusters, and the implementation of measures as localized as possible. Fast and effective response to what they call flare-ups, and to shut down the transmission as quickly as possible. So we will have clusters and flare-ups in South Africa. There's a talk that something's brewing in Cape Town. We have to attend to that as far as possible before it becomes a second wave. So yeah, anyway. So the stimulus package, 21st April, I'm heading towards the recovery plan, but I thought it's very important to talk about the background of how we got there. So there was two elements of the stimulus package. There was above the line, which went off on the budget. It was job creation, SMEs, tax measures, grants, public health, municipalities, 260 billion. Below the line, off budget, and nothing to do with the budget, loan guarantee of 240 billion for the UIF and 240 billion. So this was the one that the president was talking about. He says it's 11% of GDP. He said it compares with many countries. But that's not exactly true if you look at the detail of this stimulus package. So what I've looked at here is the above the line. So this is the budget. So the budget was supposed to be 260 billion. Job creation was supposed to be 100. There was a supplementary budget on 24th June where Treasury announced 6.1% allocation to job creation, not 100%. What we subsequently discovered is that this in the recovery plan, and I was with Godongwana on Newsroom Africa, that this 100 billion, they didn't mean that it was going to be spent in 1 year. They meant it's going to be spent in 3 years, which I'll explain later. So anyway, 6.1 billion. So the expenditure in terms of the supplementary budget, the new spending was 36 billion, 0.7% of GDP. Now, in the February budget, there were 260 billion cuts, including 160 billion reductions in the wage bill. By coincidence, these reductions of the wage bill are exactly the same as the bailouts to Eskom. So I was reading one economist from Johannesburg University. He was saying it's really immoral to take from the pockets of the public sector workers to finance the Eskom bailouts, because the workers had nothing to do with what happened, the corruption and the mismanagement of Eskom. 100 billion rand was slashed from provincial and local governments. That's in the February budget. The supplementary budget, another 100 billion rands of cuts were announced to provincial budgets, and then 109 billion rand, in the supplementary budgets of cuts. And 250 billion rands will kick in, not this year, but in 2022 and 2023. So this is what I call the 600 billion rand of austerity that I say will result in an unprecedented 3 years of declining GDP. Now, comrades, this is what happened below the line, the loan guarantee scheme. I spoke to the CEO of the Banking Association, says, no, we talked to the president and the finance minister. We said we couldn't do 200, we can do 100. Then they changed it and said, no, President, we can't do 100, we can do 67. So for me, this is not really a stimulus. They say they've awarded 16 billion rands of loans, but they've used the guarantee to shift loans to prime clients who would have got them without the guarantee. And 75% of the people who got this guarantee were white people. There was no what we call additionality. It was meant to benefit people who wouldn't have got the loans, but they just diverted money to people. And I got an SMS from a member of the advisory council and confirming that they talked to a member of the banking, one of the CEOs of the banks, who confirmed that that was happening. So the banks do not want to lend. No matter how much pleading the president makes to the banks, as he said in his speech, the banks will not lend. So the UIF has disbursed 50 billion rands. And throughout this crisis, I've been talking to the UIF, because there was this debate for a while at NEDLAC that the UIF was telling people that the surplus is going to run out. So obviously, for the past 2-3 years, Niva Makhetla started following this UIF surplus 3 years ago, and then I jumped on the bandwagon. So I got to know a lot about the surplus, and I discovered that the methodology that the UIF and the minister was saying, that the methodology that they were using to calculate this disappearing surplus was incorrect. So I just want to say they've spent 50 billion rand, the surplus is still 100 billion rand. Whatever they haven't actually, so I wasn't surprised when they were all dismissed or suspended, because they couldn't answer any of my questions, and they had to go to someone outside of the organization and actually who used to answer them. But everything is political, comrades. Even actuarial science is political. As a separate discussion I'll tell you that I had about the PIC with the Actuarial Society is involved here. So, so now let's summarize what happened. We have the Treasury above the line, 36 billion. So there were COVID allocations of 145, not 260. They were financed with 109 billion rands of cuts. Now, the provisional allocation was made of 19.6 billion towards job creation, but they didn't say anything about it. So now, this is what happened. The government in presentation in Parliament on the 1st of September said they'd only spent 18 billion rand between April and August, or 15 billion rand, that's a mistake, 12.5%, 4% of the 145 billion allocation. There was a decline in spending during Q2, according to Stats SA, in the middle of a depression. There could be a decline, I believe, for the whole year. So I believe that by the end of March, we will probably not see this 36, but I may be wrong, and we'll see a bit more details in the supplementary budget. And obviously, the 50 billion rand from the UIF is a real stimulus. So as we count at the moment, the stimulus is 1.7% of GDP and not 11% of GDP. So the mantra of global stimulus packages, and as the IEJ also says, is to go big, go early, and go household. You'll see that our 50 billion rand that went to households in terms of the grants, That was 10%, but in the global stimulus packages, it's up to half of the stimulus has to go to households. You have to go big, we didn't go big. We have to go early, we didn't go early. So the shock has to be equal to the expected shock to the economy, and it must be spent in the year in which the shock happened. Just quickly, I just have to tell you about Brazil, which I've been reading about lately under Bolsonaro. So Bolsonaro announced a corona voucher, and 66 million Brazilians, they got 1,800 Rand a month, and they spent, so it has brought poverty in Brazil throughout the crisis to lowest levels on history. This corona voucher is 5 times bigger than the Bolsa Familia that was implemented under Lula. That's number one. And then South Korea gave everybody, 97% of households, a card that was loaded with 15,000 Rand, and they had to spend it by the end of August in 3 months. And that was part of their stimulus package. South Korea has had 4 stimulus packages since the beginning of the year, because they do one, then they realize it's not enough, and they do a second one, a third one, and a fourth one. So South Korea, according to the Asian Development Bank, the growth will be -1%, which is a very good outcome under the circumstances. Taiwan will grow, China will grow, and Vietnam will grow. So some of the economies in Asia will continue to grow during this crisis. Now, the recovery plan, 13.8 billion employment stimulus to create jobs. I had when I saw the word, comrades, job opportunities, I was suspicious. So I phoned Kate Phillips, who did this employment stimulus, and she convinced me that these 800,000 jobs are real. So anyway, it's part of a 3-year, 100 billion Rand program. That's what the government says. There will be 344,933 teaching and other assistants in schools. Now, I haven't finished talking to her. I'll continue tomorrow. What the situation is as follows. The schools were under great pressure during the COVID. You know, we don't have enough classrooms to have 2 maths classes and have slower class sizes. And the teachers are burdened with a lot of work, so they need teaching assistants. So they're saying that the government or the provincial departments won't make this decision. It will be made by the school governing bodies. So on average, there'll be about 12 people allowed per school. It can be a security person, it can be teaching assistant, it can be whatever. And that will create 344,933 teaching assistants and other assistants. ECD centers apparently suffered a huge knock during the COVID period. These organizations were already surviving, you know, from hand to mouth. And with COVID, it just made them worse. And you know that these are NGOs, these are Mam Ugogo, who runs the ECD center. These are not formal sector enterprises. So the government is going to provide direct support to the centers and support in terms of employee people who work at the center. But the idea is just to give them a cash injection for them. So the teaching assistance is 7 billion rands. It's half of the program. This ECD center support is 600 billion. And there's other elements which I really won't go into. There's also environmental projects where they're just going to work on existing projects like working for water, working for fire, war on waste and such projects. And I haven't finished my investigation into this. But I talked to them and all the jobs will be created by March. Now, if you divide the 13.8 billion by 800,000 jobs and just do it over 5 months remaining of the financial year and you assume that it's going to start next year, it's about 3,400 rands. And if you assume that 400 rands will be administration, the average wage will be about 3,000 rand a month for these people. But I still don't know the detail. So the second part, so I'm talking here what is new in the recovery plan. So the first thing that was new is that 13.8 billion. And then the 5.9 billion to extend the 350 COVID grants to 5.6 million beneficiaries for 3 months. So that's how much it will cost. But it excludes the 3.6 billion caregivers grant for 7.7 million beneficiaries, of whom 95% are women. So what you see, comrades, is that the employment stimulus, the 13.8 plus the 5.9, that is the 19.7 that was provisionally allocated in here. It's exactly the same. So there is no new money from these projects. It is what was announced before. It's just that they haven't provided the details of what should be done in terms of this situation. So that's the first thing I want to say about. So there's no new money. It has already been budgeted for. I saw some economists say, no, it's a new budget, and no, they're wrong. Yeah. So the second issue is that in June, July, I actually wrote a story about this. Sputla he says at the virtual summit that they had in June, that they'd identified 276 catalytic projects worth 2.3 billion, but only 50 projects worth 340 billion were ready for implementation, and they were gazetted. Now, that is what the president announced in his State of the Nation address. in the recovery plan last week. So that was what he was talking about. The infrastructure fund will provide 100 billion over the next decade to leverage 1 trillion of investment. I must say that in one part of the document, it says 1 trillion over a decade. In one part, it says 1 trillion over 4 years. But comrades, this fund was announced in September 2018. And you will remember that the country went into a recession in these first 2 quarters. And when Stats SA announced it, the president had announced a recovery plan for a stimulus in September 2018. And he said that there will be an infrastructure fund of 400 billion rand, a blended finance infrastructure fund, and the government would seed this thing with 100 billion. And I've been searching for this 100 billion. The bottom line is that the 100 billion has not been allocated by Treasury. And last week, Development Bank, which will house the fund, appointed a CEO to run this fund for the first time. So for me, the infrastructure plan doesn't address 3 issues. As you saw earlier on, there's been a 5-year decline in public infrastructure spending. And we need to know, how are we going to reverse that 5-year decline? How are we going to repair the state-owned company and the Eskom balance sheet? And you cannot have a recovery of infrastructure without a recovery from public sector investment. Why has the infrastructure fund taken so long to set up? You can't have an infrastructure-led recovery within the context of never-ending austerity budgets. So picture this scenario: private investment goes up, then public investment collapses, continues to collapse. Then the overall result, as you've seen for the past 5 years, is a drop in total investment. And that is what is happening when the president announced 660 billion rand of the 2 investment summits, but total investment goes down because public investment is continuing to go down. And the second element of it is structural reforms. And most people, I just read on the radio, I didn't follow this very closely, they said to put in place 11,000 gigawatts over 2 years is impossible. It must have been a mistake, a drafting mistake. So I think we're going to wait. That's about 25% of installed capacity of Eskom in 2 years. It's impossible, yeah. So I think there might have been a mistake. I don't know what they were talking about. So in terms of Eskom. And previously I'd had lunch with the Eskom CEO and the Telkom CEO. And I said, now, this spectrum, tell me, how much is the industry going to spend once we allocate the 5G? He says, well, between all of us, I think about 20 billion rands. And so that is not enough to shift the dial in terms of the infrastructure investment we want. So the amount of time that people spend talking about this spectrum, it just bores me. And we need better and faster data, but I don't think it addresses the systemic issues in telecoms relating to the high cost of data. It doesn't address the issues around making data cheaper, making it a public good, and so forth. Yeah.
Duma, before you go off that slide, sorry to interrupt. Yeah. The very first entry, first bullet point, is it 2.3 billion or trillion?
2.3 trillion, sorry, that's a mistake. Yeah.
Sure.
It's 2.3 trillion, that's the 2.3 trillion that the president was taking out, but that was taken out of the investment virtual summit that happened earlier on. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So then I just want to talk about the way forward. We're reaching the end. Is that, I was going to update this with the latest statistics from the IMF and Fiscal Monitor, which just illustrates what I want to say better. But anyway, it's not much different. So what we're saying, a lot of us heterodox economists, is that you need to look at the whole balance sheet. The net loan debt is about 3 trillion. I haven't updated this. Eskom 454. RAF 242 debt. PIC has got 2.1 trillion assets in June 2020. This is after the collapse of the share prices. PIC is fully funded. The SA Reserve Bank, it's got foreign exchange reserves of 900 billion. We've got cash balances of 260 billion. I was reading a report that by Intellidex that predicts that our cash balances will go to zero within 2 years, and we're going to have to go to the IMF. But that's another, for a fully fledged, I was reading that, was it this morning? Yeah. But anyway, I don't know how true that is. And then a little bit, I won't really go into the PIC. I'll just go towards the end of this presentation. This is the debt to GDP ratios before there's a slide. This is the ones before the current fiscal monitor. This is the April fiscal monitor of the IMF. So I was going to update them. So, but the figure hasn't changed much. The world debt to GDP ratio was 83%. The advanced countries was 103. Emerging and developing countries was 53. Upper middle income countries were much higher than us. Angola, Mozambique, 110%. Our neighbors with insurgency, Angola, 80.5. So in March, we were at 64. Now, the world, I mean, the IMF has predicted that we are going to go to 78. And the world will go to, sorry, let me just go to the next slide. So the world average debt to GDP ratio will increase by 19 percentage points to 102. They've subsequently adjusted that a little bit down to about 99%. Every country will have exactly the same shock to GDP and tax revenues. They say we will increase by 18 percentage points to 82. That's in line with the average of the world average. So the IMF says will be 78%. But so in relative terms, we'll be exactly where we were before the crisis. There is no tipping point at which rising debt ratio results in economic collapse. Treasury can issue more debt. The SARB and the PIC can be on the standby to purchase more debt. So there's no reason why the Reserve Bank can't support the government in financing the deficit of 760 billion rands and the deficit of, and the PIC as well. I just have to mention that the PIC, I saw the latest Reserve Bank bulletin, it's got 700 billion rands of government debt and state-owned company debt. So it's about 500 billion for government and 200 billion for state-owned enterprises, and half of that is ESCOM. Now, the Presidential Advisory Council in their latest report said the central bank must come and support and finance the fiscal stimulus as well. And they said they must increase it from 11% to 15% of GDP. So this is a mainstream view that the central bank can come in and support this. And what they said is that they must use something called a TLTRO that was implemented by the, what's it called, by the European Central Bank. And it's also been implemented in Australia as well, where the government gives funding facilities to companies and so forth as part of the stimulus package. So they were saying there should be one package for large companies and one package for small companies. Now, that is in line with what happens in the rest of the world. For example, in many of the countries, they have one. So in South Africa, we didn't have one for small and medium enterprises and one for big companies. So that's number one. We can borrow more money. They've cut interest rates by 275 basis points. They've purchased government debt on the secondary market, and I think they started again last month, a little more purchases. So basically the government bossed the bond market and they reduced the cost of capital substantially. But this cost of capital in South Africa, I was reading this Intellidex report, is still very high. Apparently we're 200 basis points above Turkey. Turkey's got a political crisis, an economic crisis, a banking crisis, and most of their debt is denominated in foreign currency. So there's no reason why our cost of capital, so what the Financial Times has been talking about is that basically what's happened since this crisis is that central banks have taken over bond markets. They've nationalized bond markets, and the bond vigilantes that Clinton used to talk about, they can no longer dictate and discipline companies that take on too much debt because the state has nationalized every bond market in the major rich countries, and they've reduced the capital, cost of capital, and we can reduce interest rates further than they are now. So the Reserve Bank, this is what we learned from modern monetary theory, a sovereign state which issues its own currency cannot fail to meet its obligations in own currency unless it chooses to do so. We have a unique privilege in South Africa that 90% of our debt is domestic. In terms of MMT, we have to increase our level of monetary sovereignty. Now, if you look at the bond market, 30% of it is owned by foreigners now. It has decreased from close to 40% since the start of this crisis. And people are saying that's a bad thing. But I'm saying, no, the South African Reserve Bank and the PIC should have stepped in to even stabilize this market even further and to create more order on the bond market. So that's number one. On the stock exchange, comrades, this is a one that I feel very strongly about. The stock exchange capitalization is about 17 trillion. But 2/3 of that has got nothing to do with South Africa, and 40% of the stock exchange is owned by foreigners. You've got a company called Tencent, there's Naspers and Prosus, which both own Tencent. And our stock market goes up and down because of the behavior when Trump now is putting restrictions on WhatsApp and all that. It's got nothing to do with us. And I just think that we shouldn't have allowed these secondary listings they just distort our market, because what our economy is collapsing, but our stock exchange is going up, which doesn't make sense, because the reason why that disconnect between the real economy and the stock exchange, because this stock exchange has got nothing to do with our domestic economy. So in terms of MMT, we have to increase our monetary sovereignty and reduce, so we can have the space to implement an independent monetary and fiscal policy without worrying about the reaction from foreigners. We've got foreign exchange reserves. They've since declined to 900 billion. This is almost 1 year of imports versus the international benchmark of 3 months. I don't see why the central bank can't release some of the reserves into the economy. And as I said to you, when they recapitalize the banks in China, they use their foreign exchange reserves. They use their foreign exchange reserves to set up 2 sovereign wealth funds. I didn't mention that. So they've got they've got 2 sovereign wealth funds using those foreign exchange reserves, and China Investment Corporation and another one which invests, I can't remember its name. So we must recapital. We can also recapitalize our DFIs, the IDC, the Land Bank, CIFA. The Treasury, I'm still puzzled as to why the Treasury had to postpone the medium-term budget. So I've been trying to look. It wasn't obviously because of the grants, because the grants are already covered in the budget. They're already financed. So the speculation is that the Land Bank needs 10 billion rands, and SAA, the new airline, needs 10 billion rands, and maybe that is what's delaying. They have to redo the budget. I don't know, but so we can also set up developmental windows, as you see in Asia and in some of these countries, and they can also be monetary financing of Eskom debt and government spending as well. Yeah. I've also previously made detailed presentations and proposals, which I won't go into, as to how we can reduce PIC funding to 50%. We could write off the state debt of 500 billion, the SOC debt of 200 billion, and release 140 billion rands to fund the stimulus. And then prescribed assets. And the recovery plan says nothing about prescribed assets. It says nothing about the compromise position on Regulation 28. And just in theory, if you set a minimum target for under Regulation 28 for investment in infrastructure and you create that infrastructure fund, we've got about 10 trillion of industry assets according to the Presidential Advisory Council. So if 10%, they currently invest 1% of their assets, 1.2% of their assets in infrastructure. No, sorry, 2% of their assets on infrastructure, 2.5%. PIC invests 1.2%. I think it's unacceptable that the PIC invests less than the private sector, or mutual asset management in infrastructure. And I've listened to the Eskom Pension Fund. They want to invest more in infrastructure. So I'm just a bit puzzled as to why, though. I thought there was going to be mention about this in terms of the recovery plan, and I thought it was an advanced stage. I just must mention that this talk of public-private partnerships, according to the Presidential Advisory Council, in the last 20 years, these PPPs have financed just under 100 billion rands of infrastructure investment. If you look at the budget, every single year, it's the smallest part of public sector investment. If you look at this year's budget, it's about 2%. And most of the years, it fluctuates between 2% and 1% of government spending. So the PPPs have been a monumental failure. And I don't see why we should go back to, the other thing that this thing doesn't address is how are you going to get the PPPs? I don't think they can deliver what they're supposed to deliver. And lastly, comrades, this is in terms of what I think we should do. a big at the upper bound poverty level of 500 billion rands. And we have to repurpose the UIF. There's different models throughout the world. The UIF, the benefits they paid were too little compared to what people were earning. I think it's about a third on average of what people were earning. I think that these crises in global capitalism are too frequent now. They're not black swan events. Next year, we could have a commodity crisis. And if there's a commodity crisis, there could be a climate crisis, there could be a financial crisis. So we must never again leave our people so exposed. So I think we have to work on how to repurpose this UIF so that next year, if the boom in mining gold and platinum and palladium ends and they start retrenching, there should be something that kicks in to provide benefits to the workers in the mining industry. So we can't have a situation like we had during the boom where they made super profits and then the minute things changed, they started retrenching people. So we have to sort of manage these boom and bust periods in capitalism. And we also have to implement this national health insurance. I did a scenario, you know, I was speaking to the University of Pretoria gynecologists and doctors in the University of Pretoria. And I looked at the financing of national health insurance. Now, per person spending in the public sector is about 4,300. In the private sector, it's about 20,000. So if we have a national health insurance, it could eliminate wasteful, if it's well run, it could eliminate the inefficiencies in the private sector, for example, marketing spend and all the unnecessary spend, and it could have economies of scale. In theory, it should be able to achieve the same level of service to 2/3 of the per capita private sector investment. The reason I adopted this methodology is that all the studies that I was seeing from National Treasury, from the health people, they just didn't make sense in terms of the way they calculated this shortfall. And I just have to mention that, so if we say that we must reach 2/3 of the per capita private spending, the shortfall is above 300 billion rands a year. So we'd have to present, I saw a report that was done by Bill Gates, financed by Bill Gates, that was done for the ETC, the ANC ETC, 10 years ago. And actually I agree with what that report said. You must have a payroll tax, 5% for employees, 5% for employers. That will raise about 200 billion rands a year. And free education, basic and tertiary. And I did a scenario as to what it would require to have the same learner-teacher ratio in private schools as in public schools. Would need 300,000 teachers. And you can see now our stimulus package is increasing the number of assistants and to deal with these shortages. And we also need to almost double the number of classrooms. And obviously we need a Green New Deal for South Africa to drive infrastructure spend. Is there something? I think there might be many things I've forgotten. Thank you very much, comrades. Yeah. If I've forgotten anything, I'll answer them during the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Duma. Very rich, very detailed presentation. And I think what I've personally always appreciated about your critique of neoliberalism is that it's not just a critique, but you always take the trouble to make a whole range of positive proposals around alternatives. So thanks very much for that. So what we'll do now is we'll proceed to